So one of the things that we can look at when we're thinking about human beings and human decision making is sort of general sort of psychological dynamics of human beings, like right, how do human beings behave in general? But we can also look at how individuals behave as individual, unique human beings, and try to understand and classify and make sense of that. And so there's two different ways we're going to look at this. The first one here is looking at presidential leadership style. We'll talk about personality in a little bit. But I want to sort of dig through some of the more prominent research on classifying presidential leadership styles and how all that works. So I want to begin with just pointing out that when we're thinking about leaders and we're thinking about leader decision making, we should think about when leaders actually matter. Oftentimes, leaders are very constrained by context and routines and just the sort of structure of what's happening around them, so that it might not actually matter who's in power, because a lot of what presidents do, lot of what leaders do, is sort of determined by the job, and more or less whoever you put in that position will bend to the role that they're in and do more or less the same things. There are, however, a couple conditions under which the personality and the style of a leader may actually have a huge effect on a foreign policy outcome. And so I'll just kind of quickly flag these. But I think one of the common elements of all of these is that things are kind of up in the air. And so it might be that a leader is occupying a strategic location of policy process. So we may want to pay more attention to, the Secretary of State when we're talking about internal State Department policy versus a president, right? Because a Secretary of State maybe is in a position to direct and micromanage that particular bureaucracy in a way that a president might not be able to, given the constraints he or she has on his or her time. A situation is unstable or unclear. We don't know what's going on. There's really high ambiguity. It might be a situation where there's no clear precedent, right? That all of the sort of past rules about how you deal with things are suddenly gone, and leaders are again making it up on the fly, figuring out right now what's needed. And there's a level of spontaneity, right? That fluidity and uncertainty of a situation allows for the individual quirks of a leader to come through and to matter. Whereas when things are more routinized, more structured, more stable, all of the other forces around leaders can really drive that forward. Um, to make just sort of a brief pop culture reference to this, my wife and I have been watching The Crown, and it's a really useful illustration, I think, of how the structure and the expectations around Queen Elizabeth really do dictate time after time after time what she can and cannot do, even when she feels very strongly that she should act one way or that she desires to act one way. She finds herself acting in a very different direction because of the logic of the situation she's in. Um, Benjamin Barber, longtime presidential scholar, has sort of classified leadership styles in a 2 by 2 table, in which he thinks that it's useful to think about leaders in terms of sort of their orientation to the job, whether they're engaged, active, or whether they're more passive, right? How much energy and attention are they putting into the task of the presidency, versus a second dimension, which is kind of their affect. Are they more positive in their view of their role as president, or are they more negative? And so he sort of has classified these 4 different personality types or leadership styles of, the active positive, which Barber has put forward as sort of maybe the ideal for crisis solving, right? This is somebody who, has a lot of energy, has a lot of enthusiasm. They're looking to find problems. They're looking to take on challenges. They receive satisfaction from solving problems, from achieving their goals, and by and large, they enjoy the job. And so they're engaged in a way that is positive and productive and has good outcomes. The dangerous combination is your active negative folks. These are compulsive individuals. They feel a need to act. They feel a need to control their situation, but it's not coming out of sort of fulfillment. It's coming out of maybe low self-esteem, maybe coming out of a paranoia, maybe coming out of a need to dominate those around them. And so these are individuals who are very power-seeking, and seek to control the situation, not because they want to make things better, but out of a more pathological need within themselves. And that can be a very, very dangerous combination within a leader, Barber argues. The passive positive combination is more or less okay. These are folks who seek to be agreeable. These are people who like being in the job. They don't have any desire to really change things, right? They're the people who enjoy when Hail to the Chief is played. They'll go along with what their advisors recommend. These are folks who are maybe not going to be rocking the boat or changing things because they just sort of want things to flow through. Versus your passive negative leaders are folks who, again, they're not necessarily going to be, pushing forward, driving innovation, investing themselves because they really dislike the job. They'll do it out of a sense of responsibility, but it's creating a level of misery within them that they want to avoid. And so this group of people end up being very conflict avoidant, right? Because they don't have the energy, they don't thrive off that conflict and that challenge, and they're already miserable. And so Barber has sort of classified American presidents according to this sort of 2x2 typology. And he says that, folks who are the active positives are folks like Jefferson or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt loved being president. He loved it so much. He did it 4 times. And it wasn't exactly as though he had easy years as president. Tackling the Great Depression, tackling World War II. These were things that really drove Roosevelt, that he liked being at the center of all that. He enjoyed the conflict around the policy making to the point where he would actively set his aides to argue against each other because he just thrived on that kind of energy. Truman was another example, according to Barber, Ford, even Carter and Clinton. Clinton sort of famously worked like 16 hours a day as president, that he was up early and stayed up late and just really threw himself into the job and enjoyed being president. We could talk about I should say passive positive leaders, folks like Madison or Harding or Reagan. I think in sort of recent memory, Reagan is really the classic example of this, where he really enjoyed the trappings of being president. He enjoyed giving speeches. There was genuine happiness in him in that role, but he also clocked out at 5, and that was that. And famously, he would not read anything longer than a page, right? He was not looking to invest himself intellectually on any great level in the presidency, but he did enjoy being president. When we look at active negative presidents, we have folks like John Adams, who sort of famously got himself into trouble with the Sedition Act. Wilson is another example of this, Hoover, Johnson, and Nixon. And so Nixon is, again, in fairly recent memory, the classic example of this, of somebody who on day 1 in the presidency was talking about in his sort of private journals, the majesty of the office and how much, what a great responsibility it was. But by about 2 months in, he's talking about how everybody's out to get him and he can't trust anybody and he needs to, essentially dominate and control. And so he ends up, using the power of the state to go after and track and monitor his political enemies. He keeps a list of journalists that have said mean things about him that he can punish in future efforts. He's actively using the power of the presidency to compensate for his own insecurities. And then we have sort of passive negative leaders. These are people who don't particularly enjoy being president. In fact, it maybe gives them outright misery. And they're not necessarily looking to change things up. And Washington, I think, is a really good example of a negative, a negative sort of approach to the presidency. Washington did not want to be president. He hated the limelight. You probably heard the story about Washington and his false teeth or his wooden teeth. Well, teeth for Washington were a source of tremendous shame, and he had sort of a spring-loaded mechanical structure, and he had to keep his lips incredibly tight to hold his teeth in so they wouldn't pop out. And every single public engagement he had was just a personal agony and indignity for him, and yet he did it not out of a desire to be king for life or president for life, but out of a desire to serve the nation. I also think George W. Bush is a fairly good example. And over the years, I've sort of gone back and forth over where to place George W. Bush on this table, because he was quite proactive following September 11th, but I don't think that was his natural state. I think his natural state was to be president because it was expected of him, to be president because he felt an inferiority relative to his father and even to his brother. Um, and he wasn't really looking to transform America. He was more than happy to bring into power a powerful, experienced cabinet and more or less rely upon them to direct the state, which I think is fairly consistent with Barber's idea of this negative passive leadership style. And so with that as sort of the background, I'll maybe toss open sort of this big picture question that folks can discuss on VoiceThread or in discussion groups about how Barber might classify President Obama and how Barber might classify President Trump, given these two dimensions of active, um, uh, passive versus positive and negative.